Raffaele Ventresca hadn't felt a heartbeat in 20 years. He was the Iron King of Naples, a man who had forbidden himself from the weakness of love until a political debt forced him into a marriage with a woman he'd never met. But on their wedding night, as the silk of Sanaa's dress slipped, the contract died. He didn't see a wife. He saw a crime written in the jagged scars across her mahogany skin. In 5 seconds, the man who forbade love found the only thing worth starting a war for. If you believe some scars are actually maps to a person's soul, hit that subscribe button, like this video, and turn on the notification bell. Comment, Reckoning, if you want to see what happens when the most dangerous man in Italy finds a reason to feel again. The room was cold, despite the thick Italian summer air. Raffaele stood by the window, his black satin shirt unbuttoned, the glowing embers of the city skyline framing his silhouette like a warning. He was a statue, no heart, no heat, just the business of the underworld. He turned to the woman sitting on the edge of the bed. Sanaa was breathtaking, a vision in dark green silk, but her eyes weren't those of a bride. They were the eyes of a soldier waiting for the next blow. She was a brilliant researcher, a woman who had survived things that would have broken most men, yet here she was, trapped in another cage. As she shifted, the light caught the silvered, thick marks on her upper thigh. For 20 years, Raffaele had trained himself to be dead to the world, but the sight of her pain shattered his defenses. He crossed the room in 3 predatory strides, his shadow swallowing the light as he knelt before her. He didn't reach for her with lust. He reached for her with a terrifying new purpose. "Sanaa," he whispered, his voice a low growl of controlled fury. "Who did this to you?" At that moment, the political arrangement was incinerated. The Iron King was gone, and in his place stood a protector who would burn the world down to find the person who touched what was now his. The marriage of Raffaele Ventresca to Sanaa Jelani Doumbia was not celebrated with bells or champagne. It was executed with the clinical precision of a funeral. In the private chapel of the Ventresca estate, the air smelled of ancient incense and cold stone. There were no flowers, no smiling relatives, and certainly no music. Only the scratch of a fountain pen against heavy parchment broke the silence, a sound that felt more like a blade dragging across silk than a union of 2 souls. Raffaele stood at the altar like a monument to indifference. At 32, he was the undisputed Iron King of the Italian underworld, a man whose reputation was built on the terrifying fact that he felt absolutely nothing. 20 years ago, on the night his father's blood had stained their family's dining table, Raffaele had made a silent vow to the dark. He would never allow another human being to become his weakness. Love was a luxury for the dead. Since that night, his pulse had remained a steady, rhythmic march of logic and power. To the council, he was the perfect weapon because he was a man without a heart to break. Beside him, Sanaa was a study in controlled elegance. Her deep brown skin stood in stunning contrast to the ivory lace of a veil she wore like a shroud. She was a brilliant woman, a researcher who understood the mechanics of the world, yet she was currently being traded like a commodity to settle a geopolitical debt she hadn't even created. She didn't look at him, and he didn't look at her. They were 2 strangers tied together by a knot of blood and business, bound by a contract that dictated everything from her residence to the optics of their public appearances. The priest's voice was a low drone, reciting Latin words that held no meaning for a man who had forbidden himself from the divine or the emotional. When it came time to exchange the rings, Raffaele's touch was professional, steady, cold, and brief. He slid the heavy gold band onto Sanaa's finger without a flicker of warmth, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere above her head. He had told the council this marriage would change nothing. He would provide the name and the protection. She would provide the alliance they needed with the West. But as they walked out of the chapel into the fading light of the Naples sun, the silence between them felt heavy, charged with a tension neither was ready to name. Raffaele climbed into the back of the sleek black sedan, already checking his phone for the evening's logistics, his vow of ice firmly intact. He had spent 2 decades perfecting his numbness, convinced that no woman could ever breach the fortress he had built. He didn't realize that the woman sitting beside him wasn't just another contract. She was a storm, and the first crack in his iron world was only hours away. The drive to the Ventresca villa was conducted in a silence so absolute it felt structural. Raffaele didn't offer a hand as Sanaa stepped from the car, and she didn't wait for one. Inside the master suite, the air was thick with the scent of night-blooming jasmine and the hum of a city that never slept, but the atmosphere between them remained clinical. Raffaele stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, the moonlight catching the sharp planes of his face, making him look more like a marble bust than a man. For 20 years, he had been the architect of his own isolation, and tonight was supposed to be the final brick in that wall. "The south wing is yours," he said, his voice level devoid of warmth. "We will maintain the appearance of a union for the council, but in this room you are a guest, nothing more." Sanaa sat on the edge of the sprawling bed, the dark green silk of her slip dress shimmering like oil on water. She felt the weight of his indifference, a coldness she had expected but which still stung against the raw nerves of her own history. She wasn't a guest. She was a survivor who had traded one kind of cage for another. As she reached down to unstrap her heels, her movement was tight, guarded. The silk shifted, riding up her thigh, and the soft amber light of the bedside lamp hit the skin she usually kept hidden behind layers of professional tailoring. Raffaele turned to dismiss her, his eyes cold and ready to look through her, but his gaze snagged on the silvered, jagged geography of her upper thigh. He froze. The man who hadn't felt a visceral reaction to blood or betrayal in 2 decades felt a sudden, violent jolt in his chest. These weren't the clean scars of surgery. They were the brutal, raised marks of systematic cruelty. They were an echo of the violence he had spent his life inflicting on others, yet seeing them on her, on the woman he had intended to ignore, shattered his equilibrium. The Iron King crossed the room before he could stop himself, his predatory grace replaced by a sudden, frantic focus. He knelt in the space between her knees, his shadow stretching long across the silk sheets. He didn't touch her, but his hand hovered near the marks, his fingers trembling with a phantom heat. Sanaa gasped, her breath hitching as she tried to pull the fabric back down, her eyes wide with a mixture of shame and defiance. "Who?" Raffaele rasped, the word tearing out of him like a confession. The 20-year vow of silence he had kept with his own heart was breaking. He looked up, and for the first time, Sanaa didn't see a boss or a statue. She saw a man whose soul had just been set on fire. "Sanaa, look at me. Who left these marks on you?" In that moment, the cold contract was gone, replaced by a dark, shimmering promise of protection. The ice had finally cracked. The memories didn't come back in pieces. They came in a flood of heat and the smell of scorched earth. Before the marble floors of Naples, before the green silk and the Iron King, there was the village of Thelone, where the sun felt like a blessing rather than a spotlight. Sanaa had been the pride of her people, the girl who had gone to the city to study the secrets of the earth, only to return with the very people who would destroy it. The representatives from Pharmaxis Global had arrived with promises of agricultural innovation and community health. They wore white coats and spoke of progress in voices that sounded like honey. Sanaa, young and eager to heal her home, had been their primary liaison. She had translated their lies into her native tongue, convincing the elders to sign documents that were actually death warrants for their land. She had trusted the clinical smiles of the executives, believing that the vials they brought were vaccines for the cattle and supplements for the children. The betrayal began at midnight. The supplements were experimental pathogens, and Thelone had been turned into a living laboratory. When the fever took the village, the white coats didn't offer medicine. They arrived with clipboards and cameras to document the degradation of the biological host. Sanaa had confronted the lead researcher, a man with pale, dead eyes named Dr. Sterling. She hadn't gone with a plea. She had gone with the evidence of their crimes. But in the world of corporate giants, a researcher's life was worth less than the data she produced. She remembered the cold metal of the restraint chair and the clinical smell of the antiseptic as they decided to make an example of the girl who knew too much. They didn't want her dead. They wanted her broken, a living reminder of the price of defiance. The scars on her thighs were the result of a chemical burn, a disposal error. They had called it as they tossed her into a ditch on the outskirts of the city, leaving her for dead among the ruins of her reputation. They had erased her village from the maps and her credentials from the databases. By the time she had clawed her way to Europe, she was a ghost in a beautiful body, carrying the weight of 1,000 betrayed souls. Every time she looked at those marks, She didn't just see her own pain. She saw the smoke rising over the trees of Senegal and the faces of the elders who had trusted her. She had spent years running from that fire, never imagining that she would find a man whose own internal blaze was strong enough to finally keep her warm. The morning light that filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Ventresca villa was thin and gray, illuminating a room that felt fundamentally altered. Sanaa stirred from a fitful sleep, her hand instinctively reaching to pull the dark green silk over the marks on her thigh, but the weight of the room had changed. She wasn't alone. Raffaele was still there, silhouetted against the dawn, his black shirt discarded and replaced by a fresh one, though the lines of exhaustion around his eyes told a story of a night spent in the trenches of the digital underworld. He was on his fourth phone call since the sun had begun to edge over the Mediterranean. His voice was a low, melodic rasp, speaking a dialect of Italian that sounded less like a language and more like a series of commands to a hidden army. Sanaa watched him from the pillows, realizing with a start that the Iron King hadn't closed his eyes once. He was surrounded by tablets and encrypted laptops, the glow of the screens reflecting in his dark, focused eyes. He wasn't just managing his empire, he was hunting. When he noticed her stirring, the sharp, predatory edge of his expression didn't soften, but it shifted. The indifference that had defined their wedding day was gone, replaced by a terrifying, heavy respect. He ended his call abruptly and crossed the room, his movements lacking the cold distance of the night before. He didn't look at her as a contract or a guest. He looked at her as a comrade in arms who had survived a war he was only just beginning to understand. "My people in Dakar and Paris have been awake for 6 hours," he said, his voice dropping to a tone of gravel and velvet. "Pharmaxis Global thinks they buried the data from Thelone. They think they erased you." He leaned over the bed, placing a hand on the mattress near her shoulder, his presence an overwhelming force of protection. "They are about to learn that in Naples we don't bury ghosts, we give them teeth." He reached out, his thumb grazing the line of her jaw with a touch that was surprisingly steady. There was no lust in the gesture, only a grim, absolute recognition. He saw her now, not as the Senegalese researcher traded for a debt, but as the woman who had carried a village's worth of pain in silence. "Get dressed," he commanded, though the word felt more like an invitation into his inner circle. "From today, you don't walk behind me to satisfy the council. You walk beside me. We have work to do." As he turned back to his phone, Sanaa realized that the man who had forbidden love for 20 years had found something much more dangerous, a purpose. The silent protector had awakened, and the world that had scarred her was about to feel the heat of his fire. The terrace of the Ventresca villa was suspended between the black silk of the Mediterranean and a sky heavy with stars. A single candle flickered between them, casting long, dancing shadows across the silver cutlery and the untouched wine. The air was thick with the scent of sea salt and expensive tobacco, a stark contrast to the clinical silence that usually defined Raffaele's world. Tonight, the Iron King looked different. He had traded his structured suit for a simple black shirt, the top buttons undone, revealing a man who was slowly being forced to breathe again. Sanaa watched him across the table, her own dark green dress catching the moonlight. The tension from the morning hadn't vanished. It had evolved into a fragile, vibrating frequency. For hours, Raffaele had been a whirlwind of cold commands and digital warfare, but now, in the stillness, the armor was visibly heavy. "You look at my scars and see a crime," Sanaa said softly, her voice barely a ripple in the night air. "But I look at you, Raffaele, and I see a fortress. What happened to the man who lived before the walls?" Raffaele didn't flinch. He swirled the deep red wine in his glass, his eyes fixed on the distant lights of the harbor. "There was no man," he said, his voice a low, rough vibration. "There was only a boy who watched his world burn in a single hour." He leaned back, his sharp features softening into a grim memory. 20 years ago tonight, my father hosted a dinner much like this one. There was laughter, music, and the smell of my mother's perfume. By midnight, the music had stopped. A betrayal from within the council turned the house into a slaughterhouse. I hid in the crawl space behind the library, watching through a vent as they took everything. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I realized in that darkness that if you don't love anything, they can never take anything from you. He looked at her then, his dark eyes searching hers with a raw intensity that made her breath hitch. "The scars I carry aren't on my skin, Sanaa. They are the ice in my blood. I chose to be a statue because a statue cannot feel the blade." He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. His palm was warm, a startling contrast to the story he had just told. It was the first time he had touched her without the pretense of protection or business. It was a human reaching for another human in the dark. "But today, when I saw what Pharmaxis did to you," he whispered, "the ice didn't just crack, it screamed. I realized that my silence wasn't a shield, it was a cage." In that moment, the last of the invisible walls between them crumbled. They were no longer a mafia king and a contractual wife. They were two survivors standing amidst the ruins of their pasts, realizing that the only way to move forward was to burn the world that had tried to break them. The morning began with a disruption that shattered the fragile peace of the Ventresca villa. A courier, eyes downcast and hands trembling, had left a small, unmarked wooden crate at the main security gate. It wasn't addressed to the Iron King, but to Sanaa Jelani Doumbia. When the head of security brought the package into the breakfast room, the air seemed to thin. Raffaele didn't look up from his espresso until he saw the postmark, a private logistics firm out of Dakar, Senegal. He signaled the guard to open it, his eyes narrowing into two slivers of dark glass. Inside, nestled in surgical cotton, was a single rusted glass vial from the Thalone labs and a Polaroid of Sanaa's childhood home, now a charred skeleton of timber. On the back, written in the precise, clinical hand of Dr. Sterling, were 4 words: "The data is incomplete." The sound that followed was not a shout, but the sickening, crystalline crunch of Raffaele's espresso cup shattering in his hand. He didn't flinch at the porcelain shards or the hot liquid staining his palm. He simply stood, and the sheer weight of his presence sent the household staff scrambling toward the walls. The Iron King was gone. In his place was a force of nature that had been dormant for 20 years. Sanaa reached for the photo, her breath hitching as the smell of the rusted vial, the scent of her village's death, hit her. But before her fingers could touch it, Raffaele's hand intercepted hers. His grip was firm, grounding her. "Don't," he commanded, his voice a low, tectonic vibration. He turned to his head of security, and the look in his eyes made the veteran soldier take a step back. "Every Pharmaxis asset in Europe, every shell company, every offshore account, every man who ever wore their lab coat. I want their locations on my desk by noon." "Sir, the council warned against interfering with international corporations," the guard began, but he went silent the moment Raffaele stepped into his space. "The council does not live in this house," Raffaele hissed, his voice a lethal whisper that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. "And they do not touch what is mine." He swept the contents of the crate onto the floor with a violent motion, his fury so absolute that the maid in the hallway dropped her tray in terror. He wasn't just a man protecting a wife, he was a predator reclaiming his territory. He turned to Sanaa, his expression a terrifying mask of dark, protective hunger. "They think you are a ghost they can haunt," he said, pulling her into the hard line of his chest. "But they've forgotten who guards the cemetery. By sunset, they will realize their mistake." The following days in the Ventresca villa were no longer marked by the quiet of a retreat, but by the rhythmic, sharp intensity of a war room. Raffaele had stopped treating Sanaa like a delicate porcelain figure to be shielded. He realized that in his world, a hidden wife was merely a target, but an empowered one was a weapon. He began to dismantle the Iron King, facade not just for her heart, but for her survival, bringing her into the vaulted library where the true maps of Naples were kept, not the geographical ones, but the ledgers of favors, blood debts, and silent allegiances. "In this city, Sanaa, people do not look at your face to see who you are," he said, his voice a low, steady anchor as he stood behind her, his hands resting on the back of her leather chair. "They look at your shadow. They need to see that your shadow is as long as mine." He taught her the rules of the game with a clinical, almost reverent focus. He showed her how to read the hesitation in a sub-boss's eyes, how to identify the subtle shift in a conversation that signaled a coming betrayal, and how to use her own brilliant, analytical mind to find the structural weaknesses in their enemy's corporate armor. He sat with her for hours, reviewing the digital footprint of Pharmaxis Global, merging her scientific knowledge of their crimes with his expertise in dismantling empires. The transformation was physical as much as it was mental. He watched as the guarded, soldier-like tension in her shoulders shifted into a regal, lethal composure. She was no longer just the woman with the scars. She was becoming the woman who knew exactly how to make the world pay for them. During one late-night session, Raffaele handed her a small, weighted obsidian signet ring, the seal of the Ventresca house. "This is not jewelry," he whispered, his thumb grazing her knuckles as he slid it onto her finger. "This is the key. It tells everyone from the docks to the high courts that your word is my command. If I am the iron, you are the fire that forges it." Sanaa looked down at the ring, then up at the man who had spent 20 years forbidding himself from trusting another soul. She saw the terrifying respect in his eyes, a recognition of her as his equal. She wasn't just his wife by contract anymore. She was being forged into the Queen of Naples. The training wasn't about changing who she was. It was about giving the brilliant, resilient woman from Thelone the teeth she needed to bite back. For the first time since the fire in Senegal, Sanaa didn't feel like she was running. She felt like she was standing her ground, with a king at her back and a kingdom at her feet. The Grand Palazzo Real was a fortress of gold leaf and predatory elegance, its ballroom teeming with the very elite who turned a blind eye to the world's suffering. Sanaa felt the weight of the Ventresca emeralds against her throat, the dark green silk of her gown trailing behind her like a regal shadow. Beside her, Raffaele was a vision of lethal sophistication, his hand resting possessively at the small of her back. Tonight was not about charity, it was about positioning. The air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and vintage champagne, but to Sanaa, it smelled like the sterile corridors of a laboratory. She moved through the crowd with the composure Raffaele had helped her forge, her chin high, her gaze steady. That was until she saw him. Across the sea of tuxedos and diamonds stood a man with pale, dead eyes and a clinical smile that didn't reach his face. Dr. Sterling. He was holding a glass of crystal, laughing with a senator as if he hadn't spent his career treating human lives like disposable data. The floor seemed to tilt beneath Sanaa's feet. The music faded into a dull roar, replaced by the phantom screams of her village. Her breath came in short, jagged hitches. And her first instinct, the one honed by years of survival, was to disappear. She turned to flee toward the arched exit, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. But before she could take a single step, a hand caught hers. It wasn't a rough grab, it was a tether of pure iron and heat. Raffaele stepped into her space, his tall frame shielding her from the room's prying eyes. He didn't let go. Instead, his fingers interlaced with hers, the obsidian signet ring on her hand pressing against his skin. "Don't run, Sanaa," he whispered, his voice a low, tectonic rumble that grounded her. His dark eyes were fixed on Sterling with a cold, terrifying hunger. "That man thinks he is a god because he has never met a devil. You are a Ventresca now. You don't hide from ghosts. You command them to burn." Sanaa looked up at him, seeing the Iron King in his full, predatory glory. He wasn't just her husband, he was her vanguard. "Watch," he commanded softly, his thumb grazing her knuckles. Raffaele didn't draw a weapon. He simply signaled to a waiter, a man who wore the Ventresca livery. Within seconds, the power in the room shifted. A silence began to spread from their corner of the ballroom, a chilling ripple as the city's most powerful men noticed where the king's gaze was fixed. Sterling's laughter faltered. He looked across the room and finally saw the woman he thought he had erased, standing beside the man who owned the very ground he stood on. For the first time, the predator realized he was the one in the cage. The shift in the room was instantaneous, a silent predator moving through deep water. While the orchestra continued its frantic waltz, the air around Dr. Sterling curdled. He tried to retreat toward the shadows of the VIP lounge, but the exit was already occupied by two men in charcoal suits whose expressions were as blank as headstones. Raffaele didn't rush. He led Sanaa through the parting crowd with a terrifying, measured pace, his hand never leaving hers. Inside the secluded lounge, the gold-leafed walls seemed to close in. Sterling stood trembling behind a velvet armchair, his clinical composure stripped away to reveal the coward beneath. "Ventresca," he stammered, his eyes darting toward the door. "This is a misunderstanding. The woman, she was a disgruntled employee, a legal liability." Raffaele silenced him with a single, raised finger. He didn't raise his voice, yet the words felt like iron stakes driven into the floor. "You are speaking of the Queen of Naples," Raffaele whispered, the sound of a lethal vibration in the small room. "And in this city I am the only judge, but tonight I am merely the witness." Raffaele stepped aside, pulling Sanaa forward until she stood inches from the man who had tried to erase her existence. The light from the crystal chandelier caught the obsidian signet ring on her finger, the weight of the Ventresca legacy now hers to wield. Sterling looked at the ring, then at Sanaa's face, realizing with a sickening jolt that the power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been inverted. "The data you said was incomplete," Sanaa said, her voice steady and resonant, stripped of the fear that had once defined her. "It's currently being uploaded to every regulatory board and news outlet from Dakar to Rome. Your disposal errors are now global headlines." Sterling's face became a ghostly shade of gray. He looked to Raffaele, pleading for a shred of professional neutrality. "You can't do this. The council, the economic fallout." Raffaele leaned in, his sharp features illuminated by a dark, predatory satisfaction. "The council is currently reading a list of your offshore accounts that I personally provided. You aren't a partner anymore, Sterling. You're a debt that's being collected." He reached out, his hand closing around Sterling's throat, not to choke, but to anchor him to his fate. "Look at her. Remember her face. Because from this moment on, Sanaa is the law. And if you so much as breathe the air in her direction, I will personally ensure that your final lab report is written in your own blood." He didn't wait for a reply. He turned back to Sanaa, his expression softening into a look of profound, terrifying respect. He offered his arm, and together they walked out of the lounge, leaving a broken man in the wreckage of his own greed. The Iron King had found his heart, and he had used it to forge a throne for the woman who had dared to wake him. The Mediterranean dawn broke over the villa, not with the cold indifference of previous mornings, but with a warmth that felt like a benediction. On the terrace overlooking the sea, Sanaa stood in the quiet light, her fingers tracing the silvered lines of the scars on her thigh. For years, she had viewed these marks as a badge of shame, a map of her greatest failure and a reminder of everything she had lost in Senegal. But as she heard the steady, heavy footfall of Raffaele behind her, she didn't move to hide them. Raffaele draped his jacket over her shoulders, his touch lingering with a gentleness that would have been unrecognizable to the man he was just weeks ago. He had spent 20 years building a fortress of ice, convinced that numbness was the only way to survive a world of predators. He had forbidden love because he feared the cost, yet in the jagged history etched into Sanaa's skin, he had found the mirror to his own soul. He realized now that his iron wasn't a sign of strength, it was a symptom of his own fear. This journey from a cold contract to a shared war had revealed a profound truth. Our deepest shames are often the very keys to our greatest strengths. Sanaa's scars weren't a flaw. They were the catalyst that had forced a king to find his heart and a survivor to find her voice. They taught her that justice isn't just about punishment. It is about the weight of being seen, truly and fully, by someone who refuses to look away. True love, she realized, wasn't about finding a perfect, unblemished partner to lead a peaceful life. It was about finding the one person willing to step into the fire and fight the battles you thought you had to carry alone. As the sun fully emerged, turning the water into a sheet of hammered gold, the two of them stood together, a Mafia king and a scientist, an Iron King and a queen of scars. The world would still be dangerous, and the council would still demand its pound of flesh, but the silence was gone. They were no longer ghosts inhabiting a beautiful cage, they were the architects of their own reckoning. The man who hurt her is currently begging for mercy, and Raffaele is just getting started. Do you think some secrets are better left buried, or should the truth burn everything down? Drop a burn in the comments and subscribe for more stories. Thank you for listening. See you in the next story.